All right, welcome to Rockford Reading Daily. I'm not sure what episode this is. We are continuing to read High Risers by Ben Austen. We are on chapter 14, Transformations. In the summer of 1998, officials from HUD called Mayor Daley's office. The federal government had controlled the Chicago Housing Authority since taking it over in 1995, and in those 3 years, by several measures, the agency had improved. Joseph Schuldner, the HUD executive charged with cleaning up the CHA, had previously led the authorities in New York City and Los Angeles. He arrived in Chicago to find Section 8 files packed away neither in chronological nor alphabetical order. No new vouchers were being issued despite 48,000 families languishing on the waiting list, some for more than 20 years. Most of the employees he inherited seemed to be associated in some way with different aldermen or state representatives, and the companies with CHA contracts were almost all politically connected. Quote, "Everything was political blood sport in Chicago," end quote, Schuldner said of his introduction to the city. He hired a private management company to oversee the voucher programs, and he whittled down the CHA staff, eliminating hundreds of jobs. Rather than the housing authority attempting to manage its own properties or turning to residents to do it themselves, Schuldner outsourced these duties to private firms at nearly every development. A new system was implemented to track work orders and service requests. For the first time in a decade, an audit showed that the agency's financial records were complete and presented fairly. With these changes in place, the federal government was ready to give the CHA back to the city. The thing was, Daley wasn't sure he wanted it. The mayor was keenly aware that his family name, unfairly or not, was tied to the legacy of public housing in Chicago. Upon sitting down with Schuldner, Daley read him the minutes from the 1959 U.S. Senate hearing in which the first Mayor Daley said he didn't want, quote, high-risers, end quote, for his city. Daley wasn't interested in incremental upgrades at the CHA. He didn't believe public housing developments could ever be assets to the neighborhoods around him, and he didn't want to go to Washington with his hands out every year begging for another allowance of Hope 6 funding to make improvements around the edges. If the lawsuits at Henry Horner and Cabrini-Green had taught him anything, it was to avoid some piecemeal change, hung up by litigation at every development, and then shackled by each ensuing consent decree. The city's public housing projects were monuments to failure in so many different forms: civic and individual, political and historical, physical and economic. Like their place in the city's psyche, their solution needed to be monumental. Quote, "Make no little plans," end quote, Daniel Burnham had declared about his design for Chicago at the dawn of the 20th century. Daley said he would take back the CHA only if he could tear down all of its high-rises. Quote, "This is the end of your political career. You do this, this is impossible," end quote. Daley said he was warned. Quote, "It's all African American. You're not going to solve this. Don't do it. Sure, everybody believed that. Leave it as it is. But you wouldn't have a city of the future. You'd have a city of the past," end quote. In September 1999, Daley presented what would be his most sweeping urban renewal program. Under the Plan for Transformation, as the endeavor became known, the city would demolish every remaining public housing family high-rise, knocking down some 18,000 units. Over 10 years, and at an estimated cost of $1.6 billion, Chicago would build public, private, mixed-income developments on the cleared land and rehab existing low-rise public housing. The total will add up to 15,000 new or renovated family units, plus an additional 10,000 for senior citizens, reducing the current stock of 38,000 down to 25,000. Daley cast the undertaking as an even more radical transformation of Chicago and its denizens, saying that neighborhoods too long under the pall of towering public housing would finally be imbued with vitality and reconnected to the rest of the city. The very landscape would be remade, the skyline altered, the street grid restored. The replacement housing will be built on a quote, human, end quote, scale, with only a third of the apartments going to CHA residents, thus breaking up the old concentrations of poverty and triggering further commercial and residential investment. And the mostly black residents who had lived in these neighborhoods in social and economic isolation would now reap the rewards of the prospering city. Quote, "I wanted to rebuild their souls," end quote, Daley declared. Julia Statch helped pull together the mayor's public housing transformation strategy, first as Daley's commissioner of housing and then as chief of staff. Discerning and conscious, she recognized that there was little research into whether families of different economic classes would live amicably side by side in the replacement buildings, or how to manage properties with both private condo owners and public housing renters, or how exactly the poor would benefit from their close proximity to the gainfully employed, or even what the right mix in these buildings should be, or, more significantly, what would happen to the vast majority of public housing tenants who didn't get into the more sparsely populated, deconcentrated buildings. Quote, mixed income buildings are not the answer to low income housing, end quote, Stash would say rightly. But she thought it anachronistic to look to government-run public housing to make up the brunt of a city's overall portfolio of affordable options. Quote, the cavalry was not coming, end quote, she would explain. Quote, the only way to get public benefits funded today is by harnessing the market motives of private entities, end quote. This meant that in addition to mixed-income buildings, vouchers would serve as an ever-increasing number of families and former high-rise residents would have to be relocated to rehab public housing complexes that were less monolithic in their original designs. There was also single-room occupancy hotels. One would be built next to the new shopping center on Division in Clybourne. And under Clinton, the federal government was producing hundreds of thousands of affordable units through low-income housing tax credits, which offered incentives to private developers to reserve a small percentage of apartments in their buildings for people with modest incomes above the public housing threshold. Stash has served as a deputy in the Clinton administration's General Services Administration before coming to City Hall. Asked on her federal employment form if there was anything in her past that could be an embarrassment to the president of the country, she wrote that she lived in a counterculture life in San Francisco in the 1960s. She wasn't asked to elaborate. In thinking about the plan for transformation, she wrestled with the same concerns that went into the reform of the welfare system and that had always bedeviled public housing. Should the subsidy go only to the neediest, lowest income families? For how long? And how to refresh it for other needy families, discouraging recipients from staying in the system for generations? She wasn't sure of the answers. What she felt unequivocal about, though, was the harm caused by concentrated poverty. Quote, what's the antidote to that? End quote, she said. Quote, it's mixing people from different economic backgrounds, end quote. A pragmatist who believed that the perfect is the enemy of the good, she refused to let public housing families remain in the dangerous status quo of high-rises. Quote, the bad situation in public housing required that we end it, end quote. The financing of the public-private real estate deals under the plan for transformation involved a Rubik's Cube of moving parts. Tax credits, soft loans, city and state funds, developer fees, Hope 6 grants. Various public and private entities had to be satisfied and countless rules abided or officially rewritten. A large chunk of the funding for the Cabrini-Green redevelopment was expected to come from the sale of market-rate apartments, but the project also benefited from $280 million in tax increment financing, a tricky bit of temporal juggling in which city money is made available for improvements in the present based on the presumption of the future gains in real estate taxes. To pull off the colossal endeavor, Daley, Stash, and the rest of his team said they needed to be free of numerous federal strictures, and they asked for special dispensations on allowable construction costs, contracting guidelines, rent limits, emission requirements, and many other rules. HUD had a designation called Moving to Work for its highest performing agencies that allowed for greater flexibility. Chicago was still anything but high performing, yet that was the classification the city now sought. Andrew Cuomo, the future New York governor, was then Clinton's Secretary of Housing and thought submitting to Chicago's demands would set a terrible precedent. If he made these exceptions for Daley, then the mayors of Indianapolis or Cincinnati would be in the next month asking for similar deals. But Daley went over Cuomo's head to President Clinton. The CHA was named a Moving to Work agency, granting it dozens of waivers of federal provisions. Let's take I wanted to try to get to a changing in the theme of the chapter, but it looked like we got about a page and a half left for that. So I want to point out a few different things that we spoke about in here. I think the first thing that stands out is once the CHA was taken over by the federal government, seeing the backlog of families, 48,000 families who were languishing on the waiting list. Some of them have been there for more than 20 years. They didn't have any of the files in any type of alphabetical or chronological order. Everybody who worked and all the people who had contracts with the city were all done through some type of backdoor political deal. And so as we were speaking about, these people's lives were politicized. These deaths were politicized. The politicians who were running this city were exploiting these people. And they were doing it because they were the most vulnerable people in the society. And again, this is generations that this has been happening. From the very beginning, at the very beginning of the book, when they first built Cabrini-Green, there were shortcuts that were taken. There were discrepancies that were made. The amount of land that they were supposed to get was greatly cut down. And then we've seen as each decade passed, the less care and empathy was given, the less resources were given to the people in this area, and it's not coincidence that simultaneously the crimes were rising and violence was rising. And so I think that's the corruption that exists within the government, the corruption that exists within electoral politics is something that is important to take away from this as well, is that all of these issues that we're speaking about have multiple layers, and it's not always just the landlord, or not always just the mayor, or just one person. That's the person that's the face of it is often not as deep as it goes. There's so many different layers to these things, and I think that's one of the things that's been pointed out as well here. And that's, I think, that one of the benefits of reading a piece of literature that is about a specific thing is that it's easier to dissect the amount of layers that goes into each of these issues. And housing is a very important issue. We see how many different things revolved around housing in this book. Okay. And then I guess one of the other things I will point out is how even once these high rises were determined to be torn down, determined that they're going to be gotten rid of because the experiment that they had done did not work, it was still the people's lives, it's people who actually live in these areas, who are dependent on, when this is their home, that all came secondary. There was no thought about those people. No, those people were just treated as numbers. Quote, "We are going to be fighting this tooth and nail," end quote, Carol Steele announced. The Coalition to Protect Public Housing called for a moratorium on any demolition until the city could demonstrate that the plan for transformation wasn't just scattering families into the unknown. Steele had taken part in the years of negotiations that had finally settled the lawsuit Cabrini-Green residents filed against the CHA back in 1996. Under a consent decree signed in 2000, 6 of the red high-rises would be demolished, not 8, and the replacement housing would include 3 times as many public housing units as Daley's proposal had allotted. Tenants would also be able to form a nonprofit subsidiary and take 50% ownership of a partnership with the developer of the site. They would share in fees and profits, the money going to aid both displaced and remaining Cabrini residents. Steele now pointed out what she saw as basic arithmetic errors in the plan for transformation. The city was guaranteeing families with a valid lease as of October 1st, 1999, the right to return to rehab public housing or a new mixed-income development. But Daley's plan would reduce the city's stock by a third. In recent years, the city had eliminated thousands of public housing units, and many more sat vacant. Yet there were 56,000 families on the CHA waiting list, 24,000 waiting for a housing choice voucher, and 80,000 people who were homeless. And many more low-income renters in the city struggled to find affordable housing options. Where would these tens of thousands of families go? Quote, The mayor says that no one is going to be displaced, end quote, a protester at a rally outside City Hall said. Quote, we say the mayor's a liar, end quote. In a way, the CHA was hoping to replicate the successes of a scatter site housing initiative started as part of the Go True case, the class action housing desegregation lawsuit against the agency that was first filed in 1966. Rather than waiting on the CHA to build housing in racially diverse or, quote, revitalizing, end quote, areas, a judge finally ruled on the case in 1976. Families from Chicago public housing would enter a lottery, and the winners would be moved with vouchers into private rentals in better-off neighborhoods. By the late 90s, 7,100 families had taken part in the program and had been relocated to areas with less crime, improved schools, and better job prospects. Only a few hundred were moved a year, so receiving neighborhoods, often white and suburban, didn't feel inundated, and the relocated families could receive counseling and assistance with mobility and be checked on and studied over time. But now the city was hoping to find permanent and temporary homes in the private market for more than 20,000 additional low-income families. A study of the Chicago rental market that was demanded by the Coalition to Protect Public Housing showed that the city wasn't even close to being able to handle this flood in demand. Chicago had an overall residential vacancy rate of just 4.5%, among the tightest in the nation, with the availability largely concentrated in the poor sections of the city. More than 40,000 families were already renting with Section 8 vouchers, but another 500,000 renters in Chicago qualified for the subsidy, and the city had an affordable housing deficit of 140,000 units. The numbers gave the federal officials funding the project pause. Quote, HUD cannot approve a plan in which the CHA will displace more families than the housing market can accommodate, end quote, the department wrote in a letter to the CHA. In January 2000, Daley went ahead with the big public rollout. He convinced the Central Advisory Council, the tenant leadership body representing all the city's public housing developments, to endorse the proposal, breaking with the tenants who were trying to stop it. Quote, with or without us, they were going to submit it anyway, end quote, Francine Washington, the president of the group, said. Quote, at least this way we are able to include our comments, end quote. With the tenant group backing the plan, HUD signed off on it as well. Then the city's largest foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, through its institutional support behind the mayor's redevelopment effort, funding dozens of grants and funneling some $65 million into the efforts. Stash had been hired by MacArthur to lead this charge. She set about recruiting the many partners across the city needed to pull off the endeavor. She funded the researchers to study its efficacy, and she enlisted businesses to employ CHA residents who would now need to meet more stringent work requirements. Quote, we were able to have an impact on a huge swath of the city that had been negatively impacted and on the lives of thousands of people, end quote, Stash said. Quote, it was a once-in-a-generation opportunity, end quote. And so, we see here that, again, so many of these people's life decisions, so many of these people's life decisions were made in rooms that they were not allowed to be in. So many of the circumstances that they would have to endure and deal with were set up in that manner by rooms they were not allowed to be in, or not allowed to have a table that they were not allowed to have a seat at. And I think that is something that has to be pointed out as well, is that is something that this is 1990s, and again, even though this is specifically about public housing in Chicago, what I would implore anybody listening to this, or anybody who reads this, to do is to find out the history of the public housing in your own city. We know here in Rockford that, and I have to pull up the exact news story on another episode. I'll probably do that on the roundup, or the last episode, the review episode. But we know here that the Fairgrounds projects is getting ready to be torn down. The Fairgrounds public housing is getting ready to be torn down. And in the news story, it said that the federal government called the public housing in the area obsolete. And they're calling it that as people are still living there, as generations of people are still raising their families there. And so these are the conditions that people are being dealt with. These are the environments that people are becoming products of, and I think that that's something that we have to always keep in mind as we're going through and reading this. J.R. Fleming. One night in May, 3 years into the plan for transformation, J.R. Fleming was leaving the Cabrini row houses where he just sold an electric scooter when he saw the flashing blue lights of a police vehicle. He was in the passenger seat with Aisha driving one of the Vanduras and the children strapped into the back. J.R. didn't have the van registered or insured, but that didn't stop him from jumping out and yelling, quote, "What did I do?" end quote. He wasn't surprised to be pulled over. A couple of months earlier, police officers had raided his sister's apartment in 1017 North Larrabee, where J.R. stashed his bootlegging equipment and his merchandise. Acting on a tip, officers found several computers, 7 VCRs, television, speakers, and video cameras, equipment, they claimed, that was being used to duplicate the stacks of unlicensed music, movies, and video games that they also confiscated from the apartment. Give me 1 second here. Sorry about that. JR's lawyer argued that he was a legitimate music and video producer, and there was no proof he intended to sell any of the merchandise. When prosecutors asked for a warrant to search the hard drives of JR's computers, they were denied. The charges were dropped, though JR never saw any of his confiscated equipment again. A week later, he found dents kicked into the doors of one of his vans and the side view mirrors bent back. He was told the cops did it. What surprised JR about being pulled over that night was how the officer responded. He was a white cop, a mountain, 6'4", 240 pounds. Without a word, the officer reached back and smashed a fist the size of a tree burl into JR's face. Then he hit JR a second and third time, knocking him to the ground. Aisha charged out of the van, yelling that the cops should just arrest JR. He wasn't resisting. Knowing he was going to be locked up, JR tried to hand the cash he had in his pocket to Aisha. That's when the cop crossed the line. He stiff-armed Aisha in the chest, pushing her away. This was Cabrini-Green on a warm spring night. 100 people were hanging out in front of the buildings. They saw the cop shove Aisha, and at once there arose a collective, quote, "Ooh," end quote. Was that a punch? Did he touch her titties? JR's own thoughts cleared. He took a steadying breath. He knew so much in these situations depended on not panicking. Turning to face the officer's partner, who'd followed him out of the squad car, JR raised his hands. Quote, "He didn't even have to do her like this," end quote, he said. Positioning himself with his back to the big cop, he drew a bead on the man's chin. Quote, "This could have been avoided," end quote. On the last word, he slammed back his right elbow, connecting with the officer's jaw. A tooth arced through the air and landed silently on the ground. The cop followed, dropping like a felled oak. And with that, JR knelt down and crossed his hands above his head, trying to give the second officer no more excuse than he already had to shoot him dead. Quote, "That was murder she wrote," end quote, JR said. Quote, "That changed the rest of my life," end quote. The arrest didn't come easily. Responding officers arrived, running toward JR armed with nightsticks. What was he to do? He defended himself. In the scuffle, he was hit with the steel flashlight. Officers blasted pepper spray into his face. He was wrestled into the back of a squad car and charged with 2 counts of aggravated battery of a police officer, 1 count of resisting arrest, and a single count of criminal damage to a government vehicle. As the arrest report stated, quote, "Offender using his feet kicked out passenger side rear window," end quote. JR said he needed to break the cruiser's window. He couldn't breathe after all the pepper spraying. If found guilty of all 4 counts, JR could spend the next 16 years in prison. He'd be 46 when he got out, his children grown. JR had a fairly extensive rap sheet with 11 misdemeanors for criminal trespassing, theft, disorderly conduct, failure to disperse, and the 1 previous felony for the drug sale he did up on the far north side when he was 18. But his lawyer argued self-defense, showing that the police had a track record of intimidating JR. Brother Jim, writing the judge, attested to JR's, quote, "complicated relationship with police officers. Some like him and even purchased merchandise from him. Others have arrested him for a number of minor offenses, end quote. More than 40 Cabrini residents admitted to seeing the incident, but only 3 of them who weren't family to JR agreed to testify, the others fearing retaliation from the police. Officers gave conflicting testimony about who approved the use of excessive force, and a commander's signature appeared on a permission form even though he wasn't on the scene. JR's lawyer requested a history of complaints and internal investigations into misconduct for each officer. The trial dragged on, with continuances and court dates stretching into months and then more than a year. JR believed it would help his cause if he could demonstrate his dedication to his community. He needed to show the judge that he wasn't some thug. The women running his old building allowed him to turn an empty apartment in 1017 North Larrabee into a recording studio. He brought guys together from the different sections of Cabrini-Green, some of them in rival gangs, to cut a track for the coalition to protect public housing. Quote, "It's such a shame we living in vain. They took our neighborhood. They don't want us to change. This where my mother grew up. This where my family grew up. Thank the Lord he sent us to the Greens through us. Thank the Lord he sent us to save the Greens through us," end quote. He took part in 100 Men Standing, a mentoring program for Cabrini-Green fathers. He started a chapter of the Hip Hop Congress, a social activism and arts nonprofit found mostly on college campuses. His was the only one in a public housing development, and he said it was a way to use music to reach the masses, to connect colleges with the community. One of his first events was a hip-hop holidays for the homeless. Quote, "Homelessness ends with hope," end quote, he announced. With less time for peddling, he used his heat press to design T-shirts for the, quote, "Save Cabrini movement," end quote. And that brings us to a changing of the theme within the chapter, so we'll end this episode here. And what stands out to me in the passage that we just read is the continued police terrorism that all of these different individuals that we've read about have had to deal with. We've read about mothers who have had to deal with their sons being assaulted by police officers, deal with their sons being falsely arrested by police officers. We've read multiple incidents from different individuals speaking about them being assaulted by police officers and terrorized and beat by police officers. We've read about police officers illegally searching people's homes and seizing people's properties. And again, here's a story of police officers terrorizing through assaults members of Cabrini-Green. And again, the thing that's important to point out about this is that each one of these assaults, each one of these actions goes to further delegitimize this institution of policing. It goes to further separate the members of the community from the individuals in the institution of policing. And so when you wonder in 2022 why certain communities have tumultuous relationships with the institution of policing, it's because they've seen a different side of it than other communities in America. And so we'll wrap this episode up here. I want to encourage people to listen to episodes of Rockford Reading Daily. If you haven't listened to some of the previous episodes, please go back and listen to those. And by the time you get a hold of this, there's future episodes out. Please go listen to those future episodes. You can find these podcast episodes on YouTube, on Facebook, on SoundCloud, on Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts, and frankly, anywhere where podcasts are available. All right. Talk to you tomorrow.